Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on the Great Trade Reset. I'm Sean Doherty, Head of Trade and Investment here at the World Economic Forum. Now, this session today is part of a larger series of events which we're calling Trade MC 2020. Unlike many of the other sessions happening today, this one is live streamed. So most of you joining will have your cameras and your microphones turned off. However, we would still very much like you to participate. And to do that, we suggest you go to slido.com and enter the code #MC2020reset. That will then allow you to vote in the poll, which will produce the word cloud, much as the one you can see on your screen now, and also enter questions to go to the speakers. I would now like to introduce our chair for the session, Børge Brende, President of the World Economic Forum. Børge.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning from Geneva. Special welcome to all the guests and also to the great panelists. Trade is one of the core themes now in a world where we're seeing the global economy contracting for the first time since the financial crisis in 2008. This year, we are expecting, unfortunately, a contraction of the global economy of around 6%. Next year, we might make up for it, but real growth maybe only return in 2022. We are also faced with a very different economy compared to decades ago. The global value chains are now 50% of the global trade. So if there are hiccups related to the global value chains, this has huge impact not only on trade, but also on the global economy. And during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, we saw that the global trade declined, but it was up and running again in 2011, 2012. We also have seen that the COVID crisis, the pandemic, has accelerated change that was there. E-commerce has now grown a lot. We see that the companies that have come out of this crisis stronger are the platform companies. In the platform economy, the winner takes it all. But we're also seeing that countries are going back and reassessing the global value chains. They're also saying that some of the production has to be regional, even national. And how do you reposition trade and continue with a formula that has brought us unparalleled growth the last decades, but also adjusting for some necessary adjustments that have to happen? We have a great panel to discuss the future of global value chains, the future of trade. We know that things are changing very fast. On the other side of the lake now, at the WTO, they're discussing who's going to be the next Director General. We know that MC12 was also delayed due to the COVID. We're also seeing countries looking at, okay, if we can't make any multilateral deals, maybe we'll do plurilaterals that later on can become multilaterals, especially in areas like e-commerce, but also services and all this. The panel: John Denton, Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce; Matthias Hedvold, Global Head of International Commerce and Trade at Baker McKinsey; Shi-Xin Xia, Professor of University Business and Economics, People's Republic of China; and Murat Emirdağ, Chief Executive Officer at Hepsiburada in Turkey. So great panel, looking forward to the dialogue. Let's start with you, John, and related to how are politics of business and business views on trade changing? Over to you. 2-3 minutes, and then we'll have also opportunities for follow-up questions also from the audience. Thank you. John.
No, thanks very much, and I'm glad you put time constraints on. I actually am particularly well informed at the moment. As you know, ICC is the institutional voice of 45 million businesses. And what I've been doing over the last COVID period is pivoting us to a much more global, but also regional nuance. So I've been convening action groups, both Sub-Saharan Action Group for ICC, Pan-Arab Action Group for ICC, Latin and Central American Caribbean Action Group, and this morning I just pulled together the Asia action group. What that does is brings together the business communities. For example, in Africa, we had something like 37 countries and the business communities from 147 different centers. And this morning, with the 25 different countries in Asia, plus, an amazing array of business people there. And what I can bring to you is a pretty clear view. But when we talk about the global trading system, one thing that's really important for us is that there are actually some constants there from a business perspective. We want to maintain the movement and support for open economic settings. That's absolutely critical. We actually want to eliminate obstacles and distortions to international trade. We want free and fair competition amongst businesses, and we want to expand the trade in goods and services. So we see a functioning multilateral trading system as supporting all those things. It's a basic premise. And that is not new, that is a part of a continuum. We also want a rules-based system that provides security, predictability, and certainty. And we want a fair, effective, and efficient system for settling disputes. So these are just the basic conditions. But we are seeing three trends which are disturbing our capacity to deliver those things. The first is this constant move now that we're seeing underpinning COVID away from multilateralism. As I've often said, the black swan in all this has not been the pandemic, it's been the failure of global political leadership and cooperation, where organizations like the ICC are critical because we can bring together small coalitions that are capable of willing to work on these things. We also need to give a real jolt to the whole process of multilateral trade. But we need some proof of life, frankly. And later on today, I think I'll be talking about fisheries. But we need to see that occur. And we need to see that when we talk about the new incumbent, or prospective incumbent for the WTO, we need someone there who's capable of driving a reform agenda and understands the modern nature of the economy and ensuring that we have alignment between the settings that support the WTO and the reality of the current economic situation we're in. Well, look, the NAFTA was formed at the same time, frankly, as the WTO. We've now just announced the upgrade of NAFTA to the MCMSA. Where's the upgrade for the WTO? These are sort of things that business wants to see. We're also seeing, as you quickly identified, Bjorn, that there's actually a big change to the underlying systems that actually support multilateral trade. We're seeing that in terms of the supply chain argument. We're seeing some pretty arbitrary and unilateral interventions about what resilience of supply chains should look like. Frankly, governments can form views on these things, but you need to engage with businesses. We are best able to determine what a resilient supply chain and value chain looks like. We're also very conscious because of the dominance coming out of Asia, the Asia discussion this morning, where we've got something like 85% of the complexion of Asia is built of SMEs and micro SMEs. The reliance and importance of supply chains, but also access to finance to enable that to happen. We're already seeing pricing ranging around trade finance access from up to 15% now. There's actually just kind of enough around that is being priced at a very severe level for SMEs and micro SMEs. So we need to do more work in creating liquidity in the trade finance market to enable us to actually get SMEs functioning again. And that's one of the things, by the way, we just launched an action group on that as well. The other element, which I think people don't fully understand, is with the multiplicity of interventions by states along the way of COVID-19, and the fact that a number of those interventions have not been reported or are not transparent, we often do not know what we're actually having to grapple with and align with. So there's actually real information disequilibrium, basically confusion. So we need to write that. There needs to be a lot more transparency around these things in terms of access to information. And there needs to be much better coordination between business and government. I mean, if we're going to have a recovery which is sustainable, it needs to be an economic recovery which is supporting that sustainability and to actually drive the economy. Governments can't do it alone. We actually need to ensure that the private sector, which is in the ultimately the entity which creates jobs and preserves jobs and builds new jobs, are directly involved in these things. So from my perspective, they're the three critical elements. And from our point of view, one critical thing that governments should do, and this is something that we're pushing, and I think WEF's been very helpful on this, is that we actually need to reassert that a multilateral trading system that functions is actually in everybody's interest. We also need to ensure that the fractionalism we're seeing around the world at the moment in terms of protectionist stances, or I think Pascal Lamy now, proportionism, doesn't further impede the capacity companies and entities to actually operate. And finally, we need to actually think about what does WTO reform really look like? How do we kickstart? Now, we're happy to talk about this later on for the press for time now, but we need to actually have a clearly articulated roadmap for that. We've identified the 5 key steps, and I'm happy to talk about those. But we also need a leader in the WTO who can actually help drive that. But we also need the G20 to function much more effectively to support that, because frankly, at the moment, one of the things we're seeing out of the G20 is a lack, I think, of authoritative and a lack of strong motivation to continue to preserve the multilateral trading system. Some of the states have been good, but they're not actually effective enough. So thanks very much.
No, thank you so much, John. We'll come back to the multilateral trade system. For many of us that have spent long nights negotiating in the WTO context, we know that it only takes one country to stop a process that there is pretty broad consensus around. And, you know, the Doha process is still going on, and it started in 2001. So it shows that we have to be very imaginative when it comes to how does this look in the future. But we also have to be very practical about it. What are the new steps taken? No, of more tariffs, more protectionism, but also regional trade arrangements being established. What are the practical impact on this for business and countries? I think very few are so close to this as Baker McKenzie, and also you, Matthias. So please share with us how you see this as someone that is a practitioner in this field and very close to business.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope I can share some light from a practical point of view on this. But let me just set the scene first. When the Economist Corporate Networks in March listed the world's 10 major risks to the world economy, 4 out of 10 were related to trade disruption or trade wars, including, of course, the US-China relationship and Brexit. So free trade disruptions is not a new thing. It's not about COVID. We have seen a substantive impact on trade since at least 3-4 years in negative terms. Increasingly, therefore, companies must be aware and follow the developments closely. Companies in cross-border dealings must set up their businesses to be agile, resilient, and prepared. A lot of these trade disruptors are driven by the trend, as we mentioned before, on protectionism or economic nationalism, maybe a better word. And for companies, this means a new landscape to navigate in, and it changes rapidly. And I have to emphasize that this is not just about supply chain. It's very much about the demand side. We forget the demand side sometimes. And one of the major areas where we see differences is in logistics. So I think when we talk about supply chain, which I'm facing quite often in my daily work, some of the trends that I would like to share are the following. What we see right now is an increased focus on compliance. And this is, of course, very important for companies to focus on. We see, as we all are well aware of, an increased foreign investment controls focus, which will impact not just the trade and the supply chain, but also very much the transaction side between the countries. One interesting observation is that human rights aspects influence many areas in trade today, not just, for example, the export control side, where we have seen a high interest in that. And just a couple of days ago, we saw actions from the UK in this area. So it's very much a focus around rethinking, structuring, planning of supply chains, and how to secure deliveries in a cost-effective way. So what shall companies then do and focus on? Well, in the current climate, from a practical point of view, I would suggest to have a two-step approach. One thing is, of course, to handle crises like the COVID, when you just have to react instantly to do whatever it's necessary to do. But if we take the next step, or the first step, is for companies to review and analyze the business relationships and understand how to adopt and what shifts are possible. It's very easy to do this in your own little bubble, but what is important is to also go to the local market and make sure you take into consideration the local environment and, for example, local law. And when this is done, you can map up the risks and make sure that you focus on where the high costs are or the high disruptions. For example, do we have an area where we have extremely high penalties for non-delivery or for late deliveries? Maybe that should be highest on your agenda. The second step is to handle this situation a bit more long-term. And again, I think the holistic analysis is the best way of doing this. But that holistic analysis needs to cover all angles, both practical and regulatory. Very often we focus on the regulatory side and we forget about the practicalities. And it's also important to focus on what are others doing, especially our customer side or our supplier side, because the disruption we are talking about here is not something which just hurts one company. It hurts us all, and we're a little bit in the same boat in trying to solve this. So when you have done your holistic analysis, you can do a long-term plan, which should, of course, not be rushing away, making rapid changes, but instead have be prepared to do the changes that are necessary in future disruptions. So look for alternatives and make sure you are quick and agile to make changes in case there are things needed to be handled. But it's also important, which is a little bit against what I just said, to be able to rewind, because things are going back and forth. We have seen that a lot with the different disruptors and the trade war, for example. So
Okay.
Maybe just to finalize, if I may have one, I think just to finalize, it's a great challenge for the trade world to reset and change the negative trends in the world we have seen. But it is important for the companies to be prepared, and I think that is my take here. And of course, there are also a lot of opportunities in this, and they shall, of course, be captured. So free trade is important, and it will not go away. It's for us to just make sure we are on top of it.
No, thank you so much, Matthias, for this insight. We still have two panelists left. I'll have a couple of questions there. And then also there are questions from the audience that I will come back to, and we'll try to distribute between the panelists. Let me now turn to Professor Shi. You heard that there are, of course, necessary reforms that we will have to go through, but there's also this issue of stabilizing what we already have got, protecting WTO, that is also now being questioned. So to you, Professor, this dilemma about stabilization and reforms, and where do we see this multilateral trade cooperation in the future? Will we see more regionalization and more plurilaterals and less multilateral initiatives?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, President. I'm particularly happy to be on, and thanks a lot for the invitation to join this fascinating virtual meeting. My short answer to the posed question is quite positive. Yes, we do need to prioritize the stability or reform in international cooperation for the great trade reset. I would like first to emphasize that due to the pandemic of COVID-19, international cooperation become even more significant than before when it comes to resetting trade system, including WTO. So the year 2020 has been associated, as we can see, with many multi-dimensional crises. Among others, COVID-19 alone has generated extraordinary economic and trade costs. However, the crisis yield new understanding and opportunity, as well as my other panelist colleague has just mentioned. So against this background, my following intervention involves 3 areas or issues which should be given priorities in stabilizing or reforming international cooperation for the trade reset. Due to the time limitation, I'm not in a position to provide any kind of comprehensive roadmap, but instead, my remarks briefly addressing the following points. The first one, for the international commerce to function smoothly, I think trade policy and actions should support an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery from COVID-19. International cooperation that provide critical global public goods must be strengthened for this purpose. So I mean WTO reform, an old problem with so many new challenges. As we can witness the Trump administration's wide-ranging criticisms of international trade agenda and norms has hugely affected the global trade agenda. The current pandemic has even placed additional strains on the WTO system as well. So the upcoming Ministerial Conference 12 is very important to provide an opportunity to advance WTO reform initiatives and help COVID-19 recovery efforts as well. The second point I would like to mention is that e-commerce or digital trade should be given priority in trade reset. We understand that the WTO is not traditionally equipped with effective tools to deal with modern issues such as digital trade, but the COVID-19 pandemic has greatly promoted the use of e-commerce, including expansion of cross-border trade as well. So the global nature of the pandemic and its impact on e-commerce may encourage international cooperation and the further development of trade policy in this area as well. Therefore, the ongoing plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce and the auspices of the WTO is of extreme significance in many aspects. Among others, the political wills and the cooperation among 3 major players, which are the United States, the EU, and China, hold the key to the success of this important negotiation. Last but not the least, China-US cooperation, despite a bilateral relationship, has a big impact on trade reset agenda as well. So as we can see, the world's major powers are currently engaged in a careful balancing act when it comes to navigating the very complicated and ever-changing competition. So in recent years, tension between the world's 2 largest economies has rolled global markets. The COVID-19 has unfortunately even added additional fuels to the simmering US-China rivalry. But the US and China, in my view, have strong and complementary advantages. The tech war we have been witnessing and the decoupling between the US and the Chinese economy are ultimately going to hurt them both. Both countries should have interest in international cooperation. For China, I think continuous liberalization of trade and investment and develop a real market economy is helpful to fostering a healthy international environment for its development. At the US side, despite the path of protectionism and isolation in recent years, we still expected to come back to internationalism because this is the best foundation for its own prosperity and world peace as well. So I think I'm going to stop here and I welcome your questions. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. Extremely interesting, Professor Shi. And as you said, the possible decoupling between the two largest economies in the world will, of course, have a lot of impact since the US and China is almost half of the global GDP. It shows the size of these two economies and also the impact. Thank you also for underlining what you said, that it is also in China's interest to continue the reforms, also the economic reforms that will also make China more competitive in the sense of a future trade regime and also complying with the WTO. So let's go to Murat. You're CEO leading a Turkish company. You're seeing that business models also have to change now in the post-COVID world, in a great reset world. Not only do we see more platform companies, we see more e-commerce, but how much do you think those new business models also will reshape our view of international trade and commerce?
Thank you so much. I appreciate this great opportunity. So like you said, Hepsiburada is the leading e-commerce platform in Turkey and surrounding region, aiming to address over 1 billion customers within less than 4 hours flight distance from Istanbul. So just to give you an idea, as you know, e-commerce actually played a critical and essential role during the pandemic, and actually showed all of us that actually it is needed for a sustainable, scalable, and purposeful economy. So I want to give you 5 tangible examples that we actually observed during the pandemic. One actually was millions of customers were able to access products and services during these tough times. So e-commerce was able to continue the services in a non-stop, in a most healthy, secure way. The second one actually is the international sourcing and logistics. Actually, we realized the international sourcing and supply chain can be re-optimized using these data-driven e-commerce platforms as regional distribution hubs. The next one actually is the innovative ways of payment solutions or contactless delivery. These kind of new value propositions actually changed the consumer mindset and gave new opportunities to innovate. The next one actually is small, medium-sized businesses and female entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs. They were able to actually continue their business and grow by accessing new markets during these tough times. Last but not least, we were able to see also actually there are new ways for collaboration amongst government, private sector, NGOs, and academia. So it was actually a great time for us to see we can create impactful and purposeful collaborations that can contribute back to society. Just in a nutshell, I would like to say, in a world where half of population was born after internet, it's impossible to reshape the economy without taking new business models into consideration.
No, thank you so much. I think that is a good reminder. And let's also face it that half of the population of the world is younger than 27 years old. So as you said, half of the world has not seen a world without also the internet. Also see how much it has impacted now the company scene. 10 years ago, 2 of the most valuable companies in the world were tech companies. Today, 7 out of the 10 most valuable companies in the world are tech companies. It is really a big change when, for example, Netflix is more worth on Wall Street than ExxonMobil, that used to be the most valuable company in the world. So things are changing. And I see the questions that are coming in from the audience is also related a lot to this. One of the questions is, in what areas are trade rules particularly outdated? And I think this is also relevant to what Murat just said. Now, maybe Matthias, would you try first, and then I go to John. In what areas are trade rules particularly outdated?
Well, I think it's very clear that the different regulations around trade has not developed in the same way as the world trade has. And especially, I mean, we've now talked about the digitalization and the technical revolution. We see a lot of examples where the trade rules are not adjusted to that. For example, in export control and on the security side, in transfer of information, technically, there is a clear lack of understanding how quickly this is moving, and the regulations are slow to react. And that means you have to, in this area and many other areas, apply old rules to new situations. And for us as lawyers and dealing with this from a practical point of view, that is quite frustrating from time to time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, if you please, I'll let you land.
And maybe just another example is, of course, that I was trying to find a way also to loop this into the free trade agreements. Also on that side, I think the free trade agreements are not updated fast enough to deal with the transfer of this. So I think that's another area where we could try to increase the understanding of the new environment.
Well, thank you. John, where do we see areas of particularly outdated regimes? And will we then, if there's still a stalemate, real impasse on WTO, how will we see countries dealing with this? Will there be more FTAs? Will there be more regional trade deals? Or will we just trade less with each other? But that's probably not even possible, because we see e-commerce growing so much. And e-commerce doesn't know the borders.
Yeah, but never underestimate the innovation of the private sector to work their way through these things. But look, let's be 100% clear. Look, the WTO came into force in early 1990s at the same time as the internet actually went into the public domain. So let's be very clear. The process of pulling together the WTO was done absent the operation of the internet. The internet only became usable as a commercial platform when you're actually able to have agreements which came subsequent to the entry into force of the WTO around payment. Without those payment protocols, it didn't work. It was just a very interesting idea. And so if you think about it, there is an unbelievable disconnect, which is perfectly understandable, between the needs of the modern economy, as you've eloquently articulated, and Murat has actually described as well, which is now very much e-commerce reliant in terms of the way which it operates and the actual fundamental rules that guide the WTO. I mean, for heaven's sake, we actually have to argue to maintain a moratorium on tariffs being placed on digital downloads, which is the underpinning of the operation of e-commerce and for the development of database businesses. I mean, Netflix could not operate if there was a failure to maintain that moratorium, because it could be subject to imposts on one film from 65 or 122 different countries. And of course, the way in which the digital download operates is that you actually move the actual operability from one node to another. It's actually unworkable. But you actually now have to, in a sense, band-aid the actual whole process to enable it to happen with the maintenance of the moratorium. And the fundamental with the moratorium is that one country, because of the nature of the WTO, if it refuses to support its maintenance, can blow it all up. And so that's something that ICC has been heavily involved with in the last year to maintain that moratorium. We would like to see it made permanent. Of course, upgrading the WTO to make it relevant in the 21st century requires it to dramatically engage in this whole issue about how you have a global commons which can be created to support the digital world. The WTO is best placed to do it. If it can't do it, then we have to find workarounds for that. One of the reasons that we are so heavily involved in these issues, you know that from our engagement from time to time with the WEF, is because we are a completely purpose-driven institution, not-for-profit, with our ability to set norms and standards because of our 45 million stretch. We have our own courts, our own governance system. We actually are positioned to actually create an interoperability which can actually enable that, to create almost like a private business commons to enable that to happen. But these are the sorts of workarounds that will be required if your description of the bifurcation and the detachment or the decoupling goes on. So we need to have these various institutions in place. But there is no doubt that if we don't actually ensure that the WTO's rules are relevant to the functioning of the 21st century economy and the speed with which it makes decisions are improved, and that people can be held accountable for when you enter an agreement and you breach and there's accountability, then frankly the WTO and the multilateral trading system will function, and we need to look at these second track processes, which, thank God, organizations like the ICC continue to exist and be strong to enable that to happen. And yes, we've already seen a plethora. I think I've got a number here about the number of, there's 303 separate trade deals, which is kind of benign in one level. But unfortunately, because of the increase in protectionism, you're seeing the benign nature of those trade deals starting to become more entrenched and actually leading to potential fractionalization. Again, supply chains only operate if you can actually operate across borders. You actually need to be able to have that happen. And this whole nonsense, which is now describing resilience as actually really another way of saying reshoring, is going to cause huge problems with that. But we actually need to ensure that any discussion about resilient supply chains and this maintenance involves businesses, because only we know how to operate those supply chains. So yeah, we've got to up digital rules.
No, thank you, John. Thank you also for ICC's leadership on this. We have several questions coming in, and we have 20 minutes left, so we'll need to then use 2 minutes each in the answers from the panelists. I have one question: can the WTO deliver a trade reset? Maybe Professor Xi, you'll try that one.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. As I just mentioned, I think during this particular difficult or hard time, all the international institutions, including World Trade Organization, which have been providing public goods in promotion of global trade, should be strengthened. This is a very particular important, we all need to understand. So my basic point is that WTO is still very important institution. Even though WTO has been facing a lot of challenges, particularly from Trump administration, but it's not beginning from Trump administration. We all understand that, even from Obama administration, there was criticism from the United States towards the operation of a pilot body already. Despite so many crises faced with WTO, particularly from my own perspective, the cease to function of a pilot body has done a lot of harm to its independent, its very important role of dispute settlement. So I think at this time, we all, particularly from even including the United States and China, all major players should work together to make WTO great again. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we all took note of this aspiration of making WTO great again. Then there's a question here, maybe to you, Murat, from Aisha Al-Safi. How will lockdowns affect trade and investment decisions?
I think actually this is a great time for digital companies like ourselves, for e-commerce companies in particular, to invest in innovation, logistics, and operations. So we take this period of time actually a great opportunity to invest for our future. So we are investing in heavily operations, logistics, and innovation and technology, especially data-driven decision-making processes, because we understand that the demand for digital solutions will continue to grow, and we need to establish and build the infrastructure that can support and serve that demand. So this is the time for us to invest.
Thank you. Maybe Matthias, you could give this one a try. So this is from several people that are asking, how can we make the case that trade provides supply chain resilience? It's a tricky one, huh?
How can we make, can you repeat that? How can we make
Yeah, I had to read it many times myself. So how can we make the case?
Yeah.
Trade provides supply chain resilience, you know, let's rephrase it so we both understand it. I think, how can we make the supply chains know more resilience even in a time where they're being under attack? I think that's to get people to understand the importance of the global supply chains. As I said at the outset, I think we have a tendency of forgetting how important the global supply chains are. 50% of the current global trade goes through global supply chains. So if you just cut them out, that will have very negative impact also on global growth.
No, I fully agree with that. I mean, free trade is so important, and it will not go away. So the free trade and the flow of supplies in different supply chains is here to stay. And one of the world leaders said the other day that I have never seen anything negative with free trade, and we just have to face the different stakeholders' impact on this, and we have discussed this already. And as I mentioned before, I think the best way of being prepared and make this resilient is to make sure the knowledge about your own supply chain is as high as possible. So you are ready to adapt, because it will change. The environment for supply chain will change, and it changes every day. But you have to know how to navigate in that. And if you know your supply chain and your different bits and pieces that affects your supply chain, you can be ready and adapt this. But it's also cost side, and we shouldn't forget this. A lot of people have said that the COVID will make all the supply chain change. We will take them home to our own country. We will do that. That will not happen. That is for sure, because it's quite a high cost to make movements in your supply chain. So it's also, of course, a question of that. But if you do it the right way, and we have seen this, I mean, this is not post-COVID, this is pre-COVID. We have seen an increase in the company's interest for better managing the supply chain. So supply chain management is something which is high up in the C-suite these days. And we have a very interesting bit to add to this then, and maybe we can come into that, but then it's also how to be compliant and how to be sustainable in this. So you should add that to your analysis, but that's a little bit another story.
No, thank you so much, Matthias. Thank you so much. Very important points. I think small adjustments are okay, because it makes sense. You know, if 80% of all, for example, medicine is coming from one place, or 90% of the blood plasma from another one, and there are interruptions in the global value chains, that makes sense that you also diversify. But I think what's one of the challenges we're faced with is that there are no attacks on the global value chains, and we have a tendency then to forget what it has delivered during the two last decades. If you look back 30 years, from 1990 until now, the global GDP has doubled. But what was the engine of growth there? It was trade that increased 3-4 times, and that also delivered this growth that has also brought 1 billion people out of poverty. But those nuances are not always there, but I'm glad that we can bring this to the attention when we are also looking at what is at stake. John, you got a concrete question. But you, before you get the floor, you also get a concrete question here, and you can say what you were planning to say, and then you also answer this question. And there is a little bit of problems with your microphone, so if you could get closer, whatever. There's some disturbance, so we want to get every insightful word from you correctly. So if you could adjust your mic, and then I'll quote the question is from Craig Burchell. Can we trust the G7 countries not to take unilateral actions? And then you can also say what you were planning to say. John.
Actually, I'll deal with that question separately, but let's go back to this issue of supply chain resilience. It's actually really important. I mean, let's not forget the unprecedented nature of COVID-19 and its attack on the real economy. Let's not forget that we've actually got almost like the deadly troika here. We've got a supply chain shock, we've got a supply shock, we've got a demand shock, and we've now got a financial shock. Underlying all that is this huge health shock. There's been this dramatic change. I mean, the reason we launched, the ICC launched the Save Our SME campaign was because of the collapse very early on of the garment supply chain. It actually collapsed. And that didn't collapse because of human rights issues. That collapsed because shoppers were unable to go and shop effectively in the US. And so you saw a collapse of demand there. And you actually saw because of the lack of physical contact. And that went all the way through the supply chain. And we had a litany of force majeures being declared. In fact, people just refusing to pay as they sought to maintain their liquidity. And a consequence of that was more than 1 million people lost their jobs in Bangladesh. So you actually then have what's called a real problem, a theoretical problem. And it's not actually a C-suite problem. That's actually a small company in Bangladesh, which was relying upon the supply chain to actually pay it, lost its business and actually got no cash and actually had to fire people. So these sorts of issues. And what we saw very early on was a couple of things. First of all, most SMEs, if you want to be resilient, they don't actually have business continuity plans. So we had to create business continuity plans, which have now been translated into 6 languages, to actually get out, particularly in developing and LDC countries, to actually support them work their way through. The other is there was a lack of coordination amongst governments about how to respond. And there was no idea in some cases about how to get money, liquidity into the real economy. And we're still grappling with that now. We need to find some macroeconomic headspace for a number of economies that just can't provide and prime the pump in order to get that cash out there. So there are things that need to be done to get the supply chains going, because we do know, as you say, Bill, when the supply chains function, they're actually a positive force for employment, a positive force for opportunity. And so, but it does require a lot more focus, and it does actually require some real world interventions, which is really important, actually getting down into the weeds and actually unpicking what can be done. The specific question you asked about, can you rely upon, can you trust the G7? I think one of the truths here, if you look at the form of the multilateral trading system, the G7 can't do it. The G7 will make positive statements in support of it, but the G77 and developing countries will not be told what to do by the G7 in terms of reform. The best organization which can actually step up to the plate to support there is the most inclusive of those pieces of economic architecture, which is the G20. And what we need to see under the Saudi leadership is a very forceful intervention in support of the multilateral trading system. We need to see that continued with the Italian G20, and we need to see that continue with the Indian G20. There needs to be confidence built over time. Without that, without the inclusiveness which actually comes from having developed and developing countries involved in decision-making, we will not get the kind of progress on multilateral trade reform that the world so desperately needs. It won't come from the G7. It's bureaucratic.
No, thank you so much. I think, Professor Xie, could you follow up on what John just said there?
I fully agree with what John just have said. I think, as we all can see, the trade-related sources of global tension has a significant impact on international commerce, including, the changing of supply chain, and even have sparkled a fresh round of, more broadly, the debate on the merits of globalization. Some have even speculated that the disruption caused by a pandemic permanently damaged the economic bonds supporting international cooperation. But coming back to the theme, the trade reset agenda, I still think, even globalization is not going away anytime soon, but it may look somewhat different post the pandemic. However, ultimately, I'm the one of the many who still believe, this crisis have demonstrated how crucial international cooperation is in various aspects, including trade reset. Well, I'm particularly, I think, particularly important to refrain from imposing new trade and investment restriction. The best way countries can reset the trade agenda or system is to build a strong international cooperation network, which are necessary to alleviate the economic difficulties and hasten a recovery from the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We just got another question here. If you can give it a short try, Shri. It's from Mahesh Sugatan. Should we strengthen the social safety nets to avoid backlash against trade openness? You have this notion that opening up the markets have exposed also for competition that has hurt maybe blue-collar workers in developed economies. The whole social safety net piece, how can this be addressed without killing growth? These are, the big dilemmas, and also it's about the legitimacy of the global trading system. So, easy question to you, Professor.
Again, for me, okay. I just, I recently look at, some example like so-called reconfiguration of global value chain, linking economies, which could involve a shortening that reduce some regions' dependence on relatively small number of foreign supplies. So all these are very quickly changing, but I think among the variously hiding consensus, there are some reasons for hopes as well. As we emerge from a moment of current crisis, we can imagine the great trade reset, the theme of this discussion, from the crisis in a way that not only makes us more resilient to future shock waves, but also help the global community rebuild towards the better foundation for international cooperation. I think everyone here truly needs a bit of perspective, and let's do it. Not only we need to utilize the platform like WTO, but the G20, even G7, OECD, all kinds of forums to make international trade, more, to have more international free trade, to help us recover from the current pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Murat, you will have the chance to, you're the last speaker in an excellent panel. I was just reflecting, such a successful companies in the G20 economy, like Turkey, still an emerging economy. And we know that the emerging economies are contracting for the first time in 6 decades. So there is a change, but I think for the platform companies and those doing e-commerce like yourself are still very prospering in these times. Where do you see your business in 10 years?
Thank you so much. Actually, I envision our business to become a regional, actually a global player that actually can serve billions of customers. And our target geography actually is from east to Germany to west to India. That's our actually near-term target geography.
It's like a real Ottoman outreach, huh?
I mean, in a way, it's much more like being conscious about our capabilities and our logistical and operational capabilities, and also making sure where are the global players, and there are other opportunities for us to tap on. So basically, it's actually a strategic agenda for us to target first that geography, because there's a need for a end-to-end platform solution. And on top, let me just maybe summarize my thoughts. Like I personally believe the future of the world will be shaped by innovators and entrepreneurs. So whatever the system will be, I expect the new system or the ideal system to actually encourage entrepreneurs and innovators. As long as it's actually achieved, I'm very optimistic about the future of the world. There are so many challenges, but also there are great opportunities for all of us to prosper together.
No, thank you so much, Murat. And this is also very much aligned with the Great Reset initiative of the World Economic Forum. Of course, there are challenges ahead, but there are also huge opportunities, and the world has shown before that we can get strengthened out of a crisis, provided that we work together and also use the opportunities that are related to public-private cooperation and partnerships. And as Murat said, things are changing so fast. I looked at the market cap of or I referred to the market caps of companies, but maybe even more staggering in my view is that if you look at the 10 leading companies of the world today, many of them did not exist 20 years ago. So even if you're very successful today, there will be companies that are not even started that will be the largest ones in the world in 20 years. I don't think there is any reason why this will not repeat itself. Maybe the only thing is it's going to go even faster, and the trade regime should enable these changes that also can let the world then leapfrog ahead, because we still have more than 1 billion people living in extreme poverty in the world. We need more inclusion, but we also need more growth. But it has to be creating more jobs, be more inclusive, more sustainable. And of course, if we look at platform companies, e-commerce, it's also addressing some of the underlying really challenges. Thank you so much to a great panel, an insightful conversation is my biased view. I've been privileged to have these 4 great panelists. So looking forward to seeing you soon. And thank you also for all those that were listening and also and also asking questions. So thank you so much. See you soon.